how did we get here? We know that racism is a topic that our country has talked about and is talking about and will continue to discuss. But the big question is, well, how did we get to this point? What has happened in the history of our nation to lead up to this point? It didn't come from nowhere, so where did it come from? Now, this introduction into this history is going to might feel a little bit like drinking from a fire hose, but the good thing about YouTube is that you can always watch these things over again. So don't watch this and think this is the very last time I'll be able to look at this information or listen to this information. You can always go back and rewatch it. Now, I want to talk about our history with respect to racism. And obviously, I cannot cover every single possible thing that has happened in this country related to racism, but I don't think that we can talk about our history without addressing this issue. I think it is an undeniable part of our country's history. So I don't think you can talk about racism without talking about slavery, and that's where I want to begin. So, in 1441, the first African slaves were brought to Europe by Portuguese sailors. 2 years later, in 1443, that was the first slave auction held in Europe. Of course, slavery has always existed, and ethnic hatred of other nationalities has always existed. Even prejudice against different colors of skin has existed. But here's the important thing. After Europeans stole and kidnapped Africans for slaves, an intellectual justification was invented for slavery that had to do with this idea of race. So this construction of racism occurred after the slave trade had begun. You can actually read in a work called The Chronicle of the Discovery and Conquest of Guinea in 1453 that this idea was such that the author saw this one collective people as ugly beasts without reason and full of sloth, okay? So at this time, you have slavery and then an intellectual justification based on racism, seeing a group as a collective whole based upon the color of their skin, and then assuming and believing that they are inferior than any other alternative group, okay? So you have slavery first, and then the justification for slavery. Now, the European slave trade lasted for centuries and became a global force. In fact, the slaves that were brought from Africa basically supplied and supported the industrial revolutions in America and Western Europe. So those industrial revolutions were not possible without resources stolen from Africa and unpaid slave labor brought to Europe and the Americas by the slave trade. So even if we acknowledge that slavery has existed forever since the dawn of human history, even if we acknowledge prejudice against colors of skin, even if we acknowledge the fact that people groups have hated other people groups, we need to recognize that an intellectual justification for so-called racism happened after the fact. It was used to justify the slave trade. Now, one other important thing to remember is that nothing about American racism was inevitable. And here's what I mean by that. The historian Jemar Tisby wrote a great book called The Color of Compromise that talks about this. And even though you can mark the beginning of slavery in the United States, or at least the colonies in 1619, you have to realize that race did not predetermine one's station and worth in society. There's a great book called The Birth of Black America by Tim Hashaw, which talks about the Black experience in the 1600s that was not defined by slavery. So already in 1623, okay, 4 years after the first slaves showed up in the colonies, there were 2 free Africans who were married and had a son named William who was born free. In other words, this was not always there from the beginning. There were exceptions, but over the decades following slaves' arrival in the colonies, slavery became more institutionalized and more regulated with slave codes. So even though Columbus comes and discovers for himself that there are this whole other Western hemisphere, and even though slaves arrived in 1619, race, or the construction of race based on skin color, did not determine one's station. There were actually freed blacks from the beginning, but very quickly, and with total legal support, the idea or institution of slavery was directly connected to anyone who was African. So by 1667, we had a law in Virginia that said conferring baptism on an African slave does not alter the condition of the person as to his bondage or freedom. So you got to see at least two things in that law. Okay, first of all, the idea of a slave and an African were totally conflated. They started to mean the same thing. To be black, to be African, was to be enslaved, and vice versa. That was enshrined in law. But second, we see a compromise with the institution of slavery and Christianity. Baptism did not go deeper than one's legal status and did not affect one's legal status. So Christians, by law, were allowed to own other Christians as slaves. Even when those slaves were entered into the waters of baptism, their status did not change. Chains were actually stronger than the waters of baptism. Okay, so that's a lot of history. We've gone from 1441 to the 1700s, where we see the institution of slavery embedded in the colonies in the United States, or at least before the United States. Now, in the 1700s, something interesting developed. We see that the English King George was abusing his power over the colonies. The colonies are sick of it, and so they began the American Revolution in 1776, and Thomas Jefferson penned the famous Declaration of Independence, which I just want to take some time to read what he wrote. He says, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bonds which have connected them with one another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So what he's saying is that colonists are now rejecting the ownership and tyranny of the English royalty, and yet he himself and other founding fathers owned and tyrannized African slaves. So, even at the heart of the Declaration of Independence is a kind of hypocrisy or contradiction. Colonists were declaring and striving to achieve freedom from English monarchy, but not for slaves. By 1787, the Three-Fifths Compromise was ratified in Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution. So, even in the story of our founding, even in the story of searching after freedom from monarchy and tyranny, we have still embedded in the system an allowance for the institution of slavery. And remember that even codified in those laws is a conflation between Africans and slaves. There is an intellectual justification starting back in when the first slaves were taken in 1441, that intellectual justification for slavery based on race. The idea that a whole group of people based on the color of their skin is inferior. Now, after the Revolution, this kind of festering wound of slavery would remain. So a country built on the ideas of political freedoms from a monarchy has a massive slaveholding system with brutal masters. Now, throughout the late 1700s and early 1800s, there were Christian revivals. And prior to those Christian revivals, Jemar Tisby tells us that few enslaved Africans converted to Christianity. But through those revivals, there were tons of African slaves who were converting to Christianity, but they didn't cease to be African. We actually see in 1785 the first black person ordained by a Christian church in America named Lemuel Haynes. In that century, we also see, in the 1800s, we see the first historically black Christian denomination, the African Methodist Episcopal Church in 1816, which grew out of Methodism. So, from our independence in 1776 and the Revolutionary War, which Americans fought, all the way to the Civil War, you have kind of two things happening at the same time. You both have a system, a massive legal and economic slaveholding system based on and justified by the idea of racism. And at the same time, you see a lot of African slaves converting to Christianity and separating from fellow white Christians who were treating them as second or third class. And sick of that, they often created their own churches. But for the rest of the 1800s, we can see that by and large, white Christians permitted slavery. Now, at the Civil War, the two regions of our country, the North and South, fight over one state's right, which is the right to own slaves. This builds up in a ton of tension in the 1800s due to slave rebellions like Nat Turner's Revolt. There was also the American Colonization Society, which was designed to free blacks, but then send them back to Africa to, quote, civilize the barbaric continent. Black churches were growing at that time, but white churches were often paternalistic and condescending and never accepting of the full equality of African Christians. By and large, slavery was the defining issue of the century, especially for Christians. But we see that it divided white and black Christians. The Methodist Church split into North and South factions. The Baptists split as well. That's why it's called the Southern Baptist Convention. The Presbyterians split as well. So we start to see throughout the 1800s this bubbling up of so much tension between white and black Americans and white and black Christians. And there is separation after separation after separation. And so the Civil War began with Christians often fighting and dying to either preserve slavery as an institution or fight against it. Now, there's a lot more to say about the Civil War, but the bottom line is the North won, and we see the Emancipation Proclamation that freed slaves. Now, there is a brief period after the Civil War called Reconstruction, and you would be shocked to see how much freed black Americans began participating once they were able to legally participate in our society and culture without retributions. There were black politicians voting into office, black Americans who were starting schools for the sake of education. There was even, very briefly, an attempt at reparations. You can look up something called 40 Acres and a Mule, which was an attempt to give lands as an act of reparations for freed black slaves. But Abraham Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, ordered the lands returned to enslavers and a sharecropping system began. The 13th Amendment, which is hailed for the fact that it has the right to, it gives the right for people to not be enslaved, also has a clause that makes an exception as a punishment for a crime. And this would actually prove devastating to freed black slaves after, free black Americans after the Civil War. what we actually see is because Jim Crow laws came into existence and were invented to criminalize anything Black Americans did, we actually end up creating what has sometimes been called slavery by another name. So as soon as free Black Americans are out of slavery due to the 13th Amendment, are immediately criminalized, brought into the prison institution, and then exploited and used in this 13th Amendment exception clause so that they can go back exactly into a state that they were in during slavery. Some examples of some of the racist policies of the time. Interracial sex and marriage was prohibited, gambling was prohibited, riding a freight car without a ticket was prohibited, and even something as vague as vagrancy was prohibited, which could basically mean you could be arrested for walking around while being Black. So once back in jail, they were freed from slavery, but now they're in slavery by another name. At the same time, the KKK was created, which unleashed terror upon all Black Americans in the South. An era of lynching began in which thousands of Black men, women, and children were falsely accused of crimes they never committed, tortured, publicly humiliated, and killed by hanging and often burning as well. There is a horrendous story in which a pregnant woman is lifted up and lynched by a false accusation and a white mob. So this is the era after the Civil War. This is the season of our country's life in which we see the 13th Amendment and the Emancipation Proclamation as great advancements, or seemingly great advancements, for the sake of Black Americans. We see the improvement in their life by participation in politics and education. We see an attempt at reparations that would make up, or at least attempts to make up, for the fact that Africans were enslaved in this country, kidnapped, stolen from their countries, and brought over on the horrendous Middle Passage. There's all of these kind of lights, or maybe even glimpses of a better future that is immediately taken away after Reconstruction. Slavery is reinvented through the prison system, the criminalization of any Black behavior. There is unleashed a terror upon Black Americans through the KKK and the illegal lynching of Black men, women, and children. So after the Civil War, there was a glimpse of hope that was snuffed out quickly. Now, after that period, we enter into the 1900s. One of the most famous incidences that you should look up has to do with the Tulsa riots and the destruction of something called Black Wall Street. Sometimes when we talk about the lynching era after Civil War and after Reconstruction, we think that terror was unleashed upon individuals, but actually Black communities faced terror as well. You need to look up in the 1920s the Tulsa riots and the destruction of Black Wall Street with absolute impunity and no legal ramifications at all. An up-and-coming wealthy Black community was ravaged simply for its success, and white neighbors were envious of the Black community and therefore destroyed it without any ramifications whatsoever. Now, that period is worthy of a lot more discussion, but I want to move us closer to the World Wars. When America entered the Second World War, something very important happened. Black Americans entered the Second World War and fought a dictator named Hitler, who personally hated the Jews, but also systematically used his power to kill them. He unleashed the Holocaust upon the Jewish people. Now, when Black soldiers went to Europe, they did not experience the same racial hatred that they experienced in America. They weren't so often called the N-word by Europeans, and they heard no cries for lynching like they did back home. They experienced interracial relationships with European women without legal consequences or the white mob. And they fought for the independence and of freedom of the Jews. And so they came back to America with a kind of hope. We expect to have a better life. We have fought a dictator who specifically hated a group of people, the Jews, and systematically tried to destroy them. We fought for their independence and freedom. And so we're going to come back home and we're going to get a better life. We don't want to be discriminated against because of who we are, and so we expect to go back home and to be treated better. But right when they arrived, the famous GI Bill, which ushered in prosperity for white veterans, did not do the same for black veterans. Black veterans were denied mortgages, were funneled into lower level education and not four-year colleges like their white counterparts. So even though they experienced this incredible act of freedom for the sake of the Jews who were experiencing the Holocaust, they again experienced a kind of hypocrisy. This is a kind of echo of what happened with Thomas Jefferson's famous Declaration of Independence. That document says all men are created equal, and yet black Americans were not experiencing the principle actually being upheld in their country. They were not treated as equal, even though that document said they were. That was a kind of hypocrisy, and they were calling upon their American counterparts and white Americans to actually live up to that ideal. So then when, in the 1940s, when black Americans are going off to war and returning, they again are accusing America of hypocrisy. We go there to free the Jews from this German persecution, and yet we come back home and we're mistreated as well. And that gets us to the 1950s and the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. Now, this is really important because this time period is often seen with a kind of halo effect. This was kind of a point in our American history that we are proud of. And yet I think you should see this time period of the 50s and 60s as a time of two true things at the same time. So first of all, we see a powerful embodiment of Christianity at its finest in the Civil Rights Movement, with MLK and the Black church marching nonviolently against oppression and discrimination. And yet, at the same time, we see deep and abiding hatred in the crowds of white Americans who opposed those civil rights leaders. And these were white Christians as well. One of the most haunting images I've ever seen comes after the Brown versus Board decision, which deemed the separate but equal idea as a sham. A little girl named Ruby Bridges walked into a school to integrate that school and for it to not be segregated based on the color of skin. And she had to be escorted by police officers while white mothers and children were screaming profanities as she entered. These were grown adult women, mothers with their own children, who were screaming profanities at a small 6-year-old girl. One of the most haunting images from that time is actually people were holding little coffins with a black doll inside as a threat to a 6-year-old girl integrating that school. Again, we need to recognize that there were forces of light and forces of darkness, and you can't just look back at that time with a kind of halo effect and get rid of all of the darkness there as well. We see new legislation that would protect Black Americans' rights in our country, and yet at the same time, we see assassinations of MLK and Malcolm X. We see the riots of Harlem, Philadelphia, Omaha, Newark, and the famous Watts riots in LA. We see that period, we should see that period as both advancement and regression. We can see truth and lies, goodness and evil, and it's all mixed up, and we can actually see some Christians, white Christians, opposing the civil rights movement. Now, for the following decades, you can kind of see three trends after the civil rights movement. First of all, you can see persistent fights against every advancement at the time, whether that was integration in schools, workplaces, neighborhoods, or society at large. We were still determined to divide by the color of our skin. You can also see in the following decades a war on drugs. This is so important to bring up, and I'd encourage you to read The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. She actually makes an incredible case that due to mass incarceration and legislation against certain kinds of drugs, Black Americans were incarcerated at absolutely unjust rates. You can see an ever-growing conflict where Black Americans who are specifically targeted and often end up in jail because of unjust laws. Now, that war on drugs bears very little resemblance to the current opioid crisis. The first was seen primarily as criminal and warlike. You can even see in the language, the war on drugs. And yet the second, the current opioid crisis, is seen as a health crisis that needs treatment, healing, and empathy. The war on drugs devastates the Black community, and yet our second efforts to help the opioid crisis is even just called a crisis. It doesn't have to do with battle language and war language. And we see this betray two different approaches to two different communities struggling with drugs. One is about a war and fighting against the bad guys, which devastates the Black community and leads to mass incarceration. And yet the other is trying to give help and treatment and empathy. Now, because of those trends, because of the war on drugs, because of mass incarceration, because of persistent fights against integration, we see that the fallout of the civil rights movement is not that everything is okay now. We see that racism persists in the decades since then. Some of these statistics are just devastating. According to Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram Kendi, young Black men are 21 times more likely to be killed by police between 2010 and 2012. The median wealth of white households is 13 times the median wealth of Black households, and Black people are 5 times more likely to be incarcerated than whites. And the big question with that is, even if in 2008 we elected the first Black American to become our president, even if that happened in our country, if there are decades from the 1960s of incarcerating Black men and women and keeping them away from their families, giving them harsher sentences, policing them in a more brutal way, if that happens to a community and they are devastated by a warlike approach on their community, then of course we would continue to experience that fallout today. It's not as if the historical waves that come from those actions in the past have ceased to affect the Black community and ceased to affect this country. This is so important as we look back throughout this history. There are great ideals that are not lived up to. There is a position of a kind of halo effect that we can put on past leaders, where we think that time is a great symbol of American pluck and effort and standing up for our rights and standing up for justice. And yet at the same time, we see great darkness and failure and devastation of certain communities based on the color of their skin. So, what do we see in the church in this country? What are we seeing happen in the church during that whole history? Whether you start from 1619 or 1776, what do we see in the church? And the church's role has obviously been varied. On the one hand, the church has had a prophetic voice. Black Christians have called upon the state and fellow white Christians and fellow white citizens to act in their interest, to care about the crimes that have been perpetrated against the Black community, and Black Christians have been a prophetic voice for that. There's also been solidarity, where white Christians have seen the pain, had experienced empathy, and supported fellow Black Christians, sometimes at the cost of their own lives. But we've also seen compromise. There's kind of been a lukewarm playing of both sides and coming up with a kind of middle ground that doesn't go far enough. Sometimes we've seen just an ignorance of the problem, downplaying it, not looking at it, going on our merry way, and opting out of the conversation because it just doesn't apply to us or affect our lives on an everyday basis. And finally, the church has had a role itself in the perpetuation of racism. Again, going back to the first slaves kidnapped from Africa and auctioned off in Europe. Those were Christians. There were Christians who justified those actions. Not only performed those actions, but provided the intellectual justification, often misusing biblical passages for the sake of slavery and for the sake of racism. And for many Christians, the bottom line is, even if you see all of these various ways that the church has interacted with racism, even whether fighting against it or perpetuating it, we've kind of been a mix of all of those stances and reactions. We have been very varied in our role. That's what we see in our church's history in this country. The American church has played a role in every single possible situation, from prophecy to solidarity to compromise to ignoring to downplaying and to perpetuating. We've played all of those roles. Now, when we look back at this history, what view do we have? Because this is not the only part of our history worth talking about. There are things to love and appreciate about our country. In his final speech, the I've Been to the Mountaintop, Martin Luther King appealed to the written principles and documents that he thought America needed to live by. He said that he wouldn't be surprised with racism and oppression if he lived in a totalitarian country. But he read about principles in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and so he was accusing America of hypocrisy. He was saying that you claim to live up to these ideals, and yet you fail. You say all humans are created equal, but we do not live according to that truth. So we can look and see many admirable parts about our country and our culture, but it's an undeniable part of our history. It is not a long series of accidents. Although racism was not historically inevitable, it plays a major role in our history. So, what do we think looking back? There's at least 4 views that I personally reject, that I don't think are a helpful way of looking back at our history. And so I want to say what kind of roads I don't think we should go down. The first is nostalgia. When we look back and see the institution of slavery, when we see that we fought a civil war and hundreds of thousands of Americans died for the institution of slavery, we should not be nostalgic. We should not look back at some point in the past and say life was flawless in that decade or that century. Sometimes as Christians, we can glamorize the past. We can look back at the civil rights movement and really be proud of that era and own that era as our own, but we cannot glamorize our history. As Christians, we do not believe in ancestor worship. It is one thing to honor thy father and mother. It is another thing to say that we cannot recognize the sins of the past. We need to be able to look back with a sober view of our history. One of the most inspiring examples of this is actually in the Bible when Ezra, who is a priest and a scribe, was personally innocent of these sins committed by the Israelites. He still had no problem talking about the sins of his people, and he would refer to them as our sins, our iniquities. So a robust understanding of sin helps us understand that no generation in the past was exempt from failures. We should not look back on our history with nostalgia. There may be good things in the past, but we should not pretend that life was flawless at some point in prior decades. We cannot paper over or look over our history with some Pollyannish perspective. We need to be realistic. At the same time, I do not think that we should be naive about our history. Sometimes we look back at the history of wrongdoings and think that it's only uphill from here. We can only get better. At some point in the future, these things will be corrected and there will be some sort of utopia when racism doesn't plague our society. But our view of the end times as Christians actually helps us understand that nothing will be perfect before Christ returns. We don't believe that we can establish utopia by just the right policies or just the right people in charge. Isaiah 64:6 says, "Our righteous deeds are like filthy rags." Some of our best efforts at addressing racism and trying to enact justice in our world has been tainted by sin and ruined by our ignorance. I think the phrase, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, is so helpful right here. We should not be naive about our future. Sometimes when I read people writing about progress, I get the impression that they're saying in a certain amount of time, with a certain amount of effort, all of this can go away. We can solve all of our problems. And I don't think we should come to that naive conclusion. I don't think we can perfect our world. And yet, at the same time, I will not go to this third view of history, which is nihilistic, that there is no meaning, no point in doing anything right now. One of my favorite examples of this actually comes from Scripture in Deuteronomy 15:11, which says, "The poor will always be with you." This is a famous phrase that people know from the Bible. But Deuteronomy 15:11 is not an indictment of, quote, lazy poor people. The rest of the verse says, "Therefore," and this is the Lord speaking, "I command you to be open-handed toward your fellow Israelites who are poor and needy in the land." In other words, the resilience of poverty, the fact that in our fallen world, people will not have enough, that is not an excuse to be greedy. It's actually the impetus, the motivation for generosity. So even though I don't want us to come to the naive conclusion that at some point in the future, with just enough effort, we're going to perfect our society, I am not a nihilist. I think we should act. The fact that racism persists is all the more reason to do the right thing, to do the just thing, to seek the welfare of our city and our country. I do not want to be naive about racism just going away in a mere decade or something ridiculous like that. I want to fight against it. I want to work for the sake of healing this wound in our country. And I think that all Christians should get behind that. Now, this is why I reject the fourth view of history where we say something like, nothing has changed. It does not make sense to me to say that there are no meaningful differences between the year 400, 1400, and 2008. It just does not make sense to me to look back at the actions of Abraham Lincoln or William Lloyd Garrison or Thomas Jefferson or MLK or W.E.B. Du Bois to say that they made absolutely no impact on this country, that there has been no changes whatsoever. It's true that in the year 400, there was not an intellectual justification of the races that ideologically upheld slavery based on the fact of assuming some group, based on the color of their skin, is inferior. In fact, in that era, an African church father named Augustine argued that whoever is born anywhere as a human being, let no true believer have any doubt that such an individual is descended from the one man who was first created. He was arguing for a theological and anthropological truth that we are all made in the image of God. And yet, in the 1400s, there was a change. There was an intellectual justification written down in books, and countless books, to justify slavery, to say that these people are naturally inferior, naturally submissive, and it is the right and privilege and duty of Europeans to enslave them. That is a change. It didn't have to happen. It wasn't inevitable. But once it did, we've been living with the fallout ever since. That is a meaningful change. And yet, at the same time, in 2008, we really did elect a president that could not have been elected maybe 60 years before, maybe 20 years before. It happened, though, and that was a real meaningful difference. So, I don't think nothing has changed. I don't think we should be nihilist. I don't think we should be naive, and I don't want to fall into a nostalgic view of our history. Let our history be as complex as it is. Let's be realistic about our history. Let's see it as dynamic and changing and meaningful and progressing and regressing, and sometimes seeking after the truth and sometimes not living up to the truth and sometimes perpetrating lies. That's the complex history we have and the one we have to live with. Now, next week, we're going to talk about what we have in common. And I think this is so important. We need to ask the question, who are we? When we talk about every human on planet Earth, is there really common ground? Or should we base all of our interactions just on our differences? And that's what we're going to talk about next week.